Hey, what's up? This was actually a real cool video your boy Zach did, collecting comic books in the 80s. And the thing that struck me the most about it when he was talking about it was how much commonalities there were in my experiences and his, even though he grew up in Nebraska, which is literally, in the middle of America, and I grew up in Brooklyn. Um, it showed there were certain common things for American youth back in the 80s, which slowly were ground up in the 90s and pretty much don't exist anymore. Uh, and you got to still hear from the Lost Boys, that horror film. And it was interesting this time. Now, comic books, when I was a kid, you could find comic books in the grocery store. You could find them all over the place, Marvel, DC. And they were useful to me as a kid growing up for vocabulary. When I started to learn how to read, I would see a word I didn't understand, and I would ask my mom what it meant, and she would have the definition because she was really, really smart woman. As I got to the middle of the 80s and things started to change, the changes that affected us now were going full ahead. I was a very angsty youth. I had, I didn't really have a family. My one side of the family kind of acted like I didn't exist after the divorce, and the other family I had was in another state, the state I live in now, ironically. And so I got kind of lonely as people, gangs started to come up, and I had no one to help me, no cousins or anyone to back me up in any kind of situations, let's say. So I kind of grew introverted, but I also was getting angry. So around this time, you started discovering things. I started discovering horror films on VHS. I started to get into music. I remember watching the Sisters of Mercy on Top of the Pops, which was on briefly in America, and just thinking that was the coolest thing ever, with this scary looking dude who looked like the guy from Near Dark, and this crazy looking Morticia chick, if you know that. So I discovered there was other music, and and I had discovered through a magazine that your boy Zach mentions a lot, Amazing Heroes, which was a magazine about comics industry. And I would look into this magazine when I would go to the bookstore. Sometimes I'll be able to get a copy of it if my dad would buy it for me or my mom would buy it for me. Most of the times I just flip through them. And yeah, it was actually very liberal. Okay, well, that's one of my themes about the comics industry from its inception. In the '80s, it was no different the level it was at. But looking in this Amazing Heroes, I was seeing, just like with music, I was seeing these comics that I had never heard of before, beyond Marvel, DC, and Archie or whatever, and they were fascinating to me. The other thing I bring up, which I've brought up many times before, is this Robotech, this TV show, this anime collected TV show that was dubbed into English and pretty much was as mature as could be on television. Seeing this, it totally changed. Like I said with the music, it changed my outlook. There were things out there that were more fascinating to me, that were not so easy to have access to. So I had to search. Now your boy Zach brings up that there was a comic store somewhere where he was near that he would go to. Um, Now in New York, you didn't really have dedicated comic stores until like the late '80s and the '90s. Of course, the one I used to go to a lot was one on Nostrand Avenue by the Sheepshead Bay housing projects, by the McDonald's. I remember that spot. But before that, the place that you got comics in the outer boroughs, unless you went to Manhattan and went to Forbidden Planet, which still exists, which I wasn't doing yet at the time. The place that had comics and had these first independent comics that came out in the '80s were used bookstores. I remember a used bookstore on Kings Highway that used to sell back issues and comics for like a quarter. That was a pretty cool spot. Of course, it's gone now. But there was another place on Avenue U, if anybody remembers that. I know B-X does, that sold, of course, DC and Marvel comics, but it was a used bookstore that also had these comics. These were the comics I was seeing advertised and um, profiled in Amazing Heroes, but I didn't know where to find them. So just like with Robotech, it was like I wanted to find these things. Just like trying to find other music was difficult. You had to search it out. Ironic on Avenue U, there was another place. There was a record store, Zigzag Records, where you could find all this forbidden music easily. Although it was getting easier. Sometimes the Wiz would have stuff too. But now, if anyone remembers the Wiz, but now I'm going way back. So let me focus, okay? And this bookstore, which I don't remember the name of it, had these independent comics. Okay, it had Robotech. I was like, oh boy. But it also had, like these comics here, Time Beavers. That's Timothy Truman's graphic novel inspired by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Ninja Turtles, that was a hard comic to find. The issues were going for lots of money. You had like these mail order comic companies too that you would see advertised on the back of many of these independent comics, like your boy Zach was saying. So the distribution back then was interesting, and discovering these independent comics was amazing. I would get what I could, and it was just Comico, Eclipse, First Comics. I tried to get whatever was Japanese animated or manga influenced. And also, remember, at the time, actually, Marvel and DC, you had Watchmen had just ended. You had Dark Knight Returns. You had The Question, which is one of the most underrated comic series ever from DC. And you had some really good storylines in DC Comics and in Marvel Comics. The X-Men, it was a really interesting time where even the mainstream was getting edgy, and you had this stuff. Now, these independent comics, of course, it was the direct market. A lot of them were black and white, but you had color comics being made. It was amazing. I would say it's a magical time. But of course, let's not idealize the past. The whole appeal of the 80s, like you have the whole synthwave thing and all the 80s aesthetics that were popular for a while, because it seems like a time of promise. You had great movies still coming out in the 80s, but we all know it was a cover. It was a decadent cover, so to speak. The forces that were acting underneath were continuing onward. I mean, for example, this movie here. Look at this actor here. He had a sorry end, in a movie. In these movies, what was happening in Hollywood to these young actors obviously was utterly disgusting and vile. What was going on at the time too? There was a lot of crime back in the 80s. It's interesting in New York, but in general, a lot of people from this time, my age, a little older, a little younger, a lot of them are not doing too well in the age range that me and your boy Zach are in. I would argue that the 80s, the nostalgia and the 80s stuff, it seemed like there was promise back then, and there was. Listen, it was so colorful. The Japanese influence was coming in. You had edgy comics, that were not SJW, although they were paving the way for that. And you had a lot of like idealistic and conflicted youth like myself. Really saw, this was like being rebellious. What a joke. But the point I'm getting at is that there is value from this time. Okay, when your boy Zach was talking about this, he said that things hadn't changed a lot. Well, a lot of things have changed. The other things I remember, the kind of things you did, the cohesion, even back where I was at, which was, I would argue, more on the alienation and changing track than where Zach was. There were still remnants of that, which had been all but evaporated by the 1990s. And of course, the demographic changes are huge, and the nerd culture was not yet commodified, and the comic book store guy was always a big fat dude with a beard who could be salty. Just like the record store people could be snotty. That was that culture which is now ubiquitous. It is your hipster corporate culture. But the point I wanted to make at the end of this was that for me, the 80s offers an interesting opportunity in terms of influence of the comics that I'm working on, is to take that aesthetic and to do the opposite of what a lot of this stuff was used for, to kind of twist it onto its head for the values that I think were useful, that I think are good for the future that you're going into. So people have the sad 80s nostalgia. Nostalgia is melancholia. Nostalgia is decadence. But nostalgia is also beautiful in a lot of ways. The truth is that I'm actually pretty lucky in some ways, and I've aged very well. And the people I know back then, being alienated back then and having problems, well, it may have made us bitter, middle-aged men, but at least we were able to function. I guess you could say we were the bellwethers, where a lot of people in this age range have been totally devastated, and I see it, and it really is amazing. But you have to soldier on. There is some benefits, I guess, to being exposed to this stuff at an early age and surviving it. Like almost like getting antibodies to this filth. And it's not a joke that so many former leftist and liberal-minded people that I know growing up, how we have changed, how we have shifted. In some ways, we haven't. I think we're still pretty fair, but whatever. That's just a postscript. So, and I dedicate this video to my oldest friend B-X, who's been in the middle of this situation and is still going forward strong. We went through all these stuff as alienated youth, and we had a rough time struggling, but we may be older, more cynical, but and there was one positive aspect of this, as this false kingdom is now being shown for what it was. But man, it looked cool. All right, later.